Now what we are going to study today is a very basic truth about the international system, and it will answer many of your questions like why India and China or US and China looks into fighting mode all the time. This is not just any random question, because notice one thing: if there is a conflict going on, at least one of the major power will definitely be there. So I strongly advise every serious UPSC aspirant to watch this video carefully and understand it thoroughly, because the concept we will discuss here are not some kind of value addition. They are foundational to mastering IR4 means. And in fact, I can bet that many of the ideas or framework or the deeper connection you will learn here are probably not even covered properly in the foundational courses that most people usually rely on. So you watch it attentively, and this one video will help you understand everything that is going around you, be it Pakistan's proxy warfare or India's Operation Sindoor or China's Belt Road Initiative and many other such happenings involving great power rivalries. So let's start with it then. Now, the first thing I assume that you might have noticed that US and China are in some kind of race for economic, technological, and military dominance. US and China are in some kind of race for economic, technological, and military dominance. You might have seen tariff war between these two countries or restrictions on critical minerals or many other such actions. So why these two countries are trying to outpace each other in this race? And more importantly, why they are competing in the first place? Why can't they just cooperate with each other? Now just take a pause and think why US and China can't coexist peacefully. Now to understand all this, we will take an example of the World War I, because this is a historical event. And historical events provides clean and clear understanding of some hidden realities of the international system, which we might find difficult to understand with current happenings. If we start reading current happenings directly without any background linkages, then everything will appear as scattered and fragmented. So taking example of World War I, we will first create a broad framework of actors and processes that resulted into World War. And then we will replace those actors with India, China or US, and the processes will remain the same. So what exactly we are going to learn here is that why and how things happened during the World War I, because the reasoning will almost remain similar for our contemporary events. So our approach will be learning from the past and applying it to the present. That's the simple formula we will use here. Easy? Now moving on, the most significant, the most important question we will try to explore here, was the World War I an accident or an outcome of deliberate choices of European leaders? Did they know that choices they were making may result into a war that big, which would kill almost 17 million people? So to understand it, let's go back to the time prior to the World War I, because something must have happened in that period which ultimately culminated into a world war. Right? Now in 1900s, Europe was the most civilized, most economically interconnected, and most diplomatically sophisticated region on Earth. Europe was most civilized, most economically interconnected, and most diplomatically sophisticated region on Earth. Major power like Britain, Germany, France, Russia had elaborate diplomatic networks. In fact, the royal families in these countries were literally related to each other by blood. For example, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was the grandson of Queen Victoria of Britain, and he was cousin of King George V. Even Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, was related to Queen Victoria. And despite having such close relationships, the so-called civilized, interconnected nations in 1914 jumped into the most catastrophic war in human history up to that point. But the most curious thing was, not a single major leader in any of those countries actually planned for it or wanted at the scale it became. Then the question becomes, how did it happen if nobody wanted it in the first place? So to understand it, let's start with Britain and Germany first, because their story is the cleanest and most instructive example of underlying concept we are trying to learn. Now, what happened that in the late 19th century, Britain was the dominant power, ruling over one-fourth of the world population, and Germany was a rising power. Britain was a dominant power, and Germany was a rising power. Then under Bismarck and then Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany had unified and industrialized at a drastic pace and became the most powerful economy in the continental Europe. Even Germany surpassed Britain in steel production. In fact, Germany was producing twice that of Britain at that time. Its chemical and electrical industries were world leading. Almost 15% of global manufacturing output came from Germany alone, compared to 13% of that of Britain's contribution to global manufacturing. So Germany was a rising power by every economic measure, while Britain, on the other hand, had built its entire strategic identity around one thing, that is naval supremacy. It was all because of Royal Navy that Britain had built and maintained its global empire, because it was sea that connected Britain with its colonies. So, so Britain rationally was simple, that control the seas and you control the trade routes. And once you control the trade routes, you control the empire. So Britain's reasoning was control the seas, control the seas, and control the trade routes. And once trade routes are controlled, you control the empire. Control the empire. That was the British formula, and it required only one thing, that no other power could challenge British naval dominance. So for Britain, naval supremacy was kind of non-negotiable, was non-negotiable for the survival of the empire. But why would Germany bother itself in knowing what Britain wants? The only thing they would care about is how to make Germany powerful. And Germany's leaders, especially Kaiser, believed that a great power needed a great navy apart from a great army. And it was not some random thought. It was believed that Kaiser was influenced by writings of American Captain Alfred Mahan, who believed a strong navy is prerequisite to national greatness. Because without strong navy, you could not protect your interest globally. You could not protect your overseas trade. You could not get the kind of global reach that Britain already had. So for Germany, navy became the last piece for becoming the global power. And nothing was wrong in it. For example, if your neighbor is rich, then there is nothing wrong you seeking the same luxuries. There is no ill intentions involved in it. So similar was the case with Germany. So they had to work upon building a strong navy. And consequently, Germany began building navy under what we call Tripp's naval laws of 1898 and then in 1900. But one thing we need to be clear about, that Germany never intended to defeat Britain at sea. It was trying to build what Tripp's called a risk fleet, a fleet that would be large enough that Britain would not dare to attack it. So it was purely defensive in its logic. But Britain viewed it differently. They did not see it as a defensive risk fleet. The Admiralty in Britain was very much apprehensive about Germany's design. In fact, Sir Edward Grey once told King Edward VII that if German fleet ever becomes superior to ours, the German army can conquer the Britain. And this was the perception that Britain had about Germany's naval plan. So German fleet was seen as an instrument of aggression. German fleet was seen as an instrument of aggression. They saw it as an existential threat to British naval supremacy. And a threat to naval supremacy means a threat to Britain and its empire. So Britain had no other choice. It had to respond with its own naval development program. Consequently, the Britain launched the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, which was a revolutionary battleship design. And revolution in the sense that it made every existing warship all over the world obsolete overnight. So Britain's message to Germany was clear and loud that no matter how hard you try, we will not be caught in this race. We will outbuild you every time. Now Germany saw the dreadnought, and it was clear in Berlin that their risk fleet is now useless. So obviously it was not considered as Britain's defensive step. Instead, it was seen as Britain's determination to permanently lock Germany into naval inferiority. Now, the understanding was very obvious, and as a result, Germany accelerated its own naval program, and consequently, they launched their Nassau-class dreadnoughts in 1908. To which, in response, Britain accelerated its own program further, and in return, Germany accelerated further, and by this, a loop was created, every action feeding the anxiety of the opponent. So by 1914, both nations had spent enormous national wealth on fleets of battleships. And not just leaders, even population in both countries had been driven into nationalist fervor. As much as there was a public outcry in Britain to increase the rate of building dreadnoughts to outpace Germans. People were like, we want 8 and we won't wait. That Britain should build 8 dreadnoughts every year in response to 4 built by Germany. Now both countries were locked into a never-ending race of dominance. And not just this, their arm buildup was not enough to provide them a sense of security. Additionally, both had built a vast alliance system as an extra layer of protection. On one side, Germany was tied to Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and on the other side, Britain was tied to France and Russia. And these alliances, although built for defensive regions, created a system so explosive or so volatile where a single spark could trigger a cascade that might pull every major power into wildfire. And nothing surprising that assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand effectively provided that spark. But the most interesting part is neither side intentionally chose the war, and at least not on that scale. It was not that German Kaiser woke up one morning and decided to destroy European civilization at once, or Britain had any plan to throw an entire young generation into trenches of Flanders. So why did it happen when nobody wants it? So it was not a matter of deliberate choices. It was not a matter of deliberate choices. Instead, it was something far more structural than an accident. Something far more structural than accident. Now see, each state was acting rationally to protect itself. Right? There is nothing wrong or irrational in making oneself more secure. But in reality, these actions like naval build-up, the alliances, and the forward positions, all these created a system so tightly wound, so saturated with mutual suspicion and defensive preparations that when the spark came, it could not be contained. Now, what was observed that all were rational actors, but it produced collective catastrophe. All were rational actors, but it produced collective catastrophe. So this structural feature of the international system is something we precisely call as the security dilemma. The security dilemma. It is the condition in which one state takes an action to enhance its own security. To enhance its own security, like what Germany did when it started building its risk fleet. While the second state unable to verify whether that action is defensive or offensive. Action is defensive or offensive, respond with its own military buildup, like what Britain did when it built Dreadnought. Now the first state sees this response and feels more threatened. It sees it sees confirmation of its initial fear. Now it builds further. Consequently, the second state builds further. So every action by either state acted as a feedback for the other state response, and ultimately both states end up spending more and more and feeling less secure. But see, the most devastating element, the element that makes it a dilemma rather than simply a problem, is that every individual step in this spiral is rational, but the collective outcome is catastrophic. In this, no single actor is fully responsible for it. Germany was rational to want a naval power. Britain was rational to defend its naval supremacy. Both were rational to build alliances, and together their rational actions produced an irrational outcome. It is not like a problem, because a problem has a solution. You identify the cause, you remove it, and then the problem goes away. Because you identify the cause, then you remove it, and the problem goes away. But a dilemma is different. It means whatever choice you make, there will always be an associated risk. For example, if you keep building up arms, if you keep building up arms, if you keep building up arms, then it will intensify the spiral. It will intensify the spiral. But if you choose to disarm, you may leave yourself genuinely vulnerable. If you choose to disarm, you leave yourself vulnerable. Then there is a third choice where you decide to engage diplomatically. Still, there will be a risk. Now, you are not sure if the other party will honor its commitment or not. The dilemma doesn't resolve with different choices, it only transforms. Clear? So, to summarize all this, first we have seen what security dilemma is. Second, we have seen what choices do we have in this condition, as there is no easy way out of it. But getting out of it is the second step. The first step is to ask, why does this dilemma exist at all? Is there any possibility where no such dilemma may arise in the first place? So let's decode it first. Why dilemma came into existence? Why dilemma came into existence, and what are the conditions that make dilemma rather a permanent reality? What are the conditions that makes it a permanent reality of the international system? Now, here in this video, I will provide a brief overview of why dilemma exists, but to understand it in detail, you can watch my another video on realism. I have pasted the link in the description of this video. Fine. Now, moving on, as a matter of fact, we know that there is no global authority. There is no global authority. No global authority that can compel a powerful state to do anything it does not want to do. There is no world police. There is no international court that can enforce international laws. Now, you may think that UN exists, or ICC or ICJ exist, but all these institutions cannot enforce its resolution against the powerful state. You have seen Russia invaded Ukraine, US attacked Venezuela and Iran, and China constantly violating international norms in the South China Sea. But none of these big institutions can do anything about whatever these powerful states do. So in the international system, rules exist, but there is no enforcement. Rules exist, but no enforcement. And in international relations, This condition is called as anarchy. This condition is called as anarchy. It means there is no authority above sovereign state. No authority above sovereign states. There is no government above governments. States are the highest unit, and above them there is no one that can compel them in following the rules. Now, in an anarchic system, when there is no suprapower to protect, it becomes the responsibility of every state to protect itself. There is no one who can guarantee your security or your integrity and sovereignty. So you are on your own. That's why every state tries to arm itself. They try to build alliances because ultimately you have to prepare for worst case scenarios. And it is this condition of anarchy and resultant self-help system which makes the security dilemma a structural feature of international relations. No matter what choices do country makes, it will always exist. The only difference is that sometimes countries choose to engage diplomatically instead of building up arms and alliances. That's why in normal times it seems less visible. Only time it comes into sight is when countries bind each other in aggressive competition. Now write down an additional fact that the term security dilemma was formally coined by John Herz in 1915. By John Herz, H-E-R-Z, in 1915. Now we know that it is a structural feature of the international system, and as long as the world exists, the situations remain there as an underlying reality. So, do we need to worry about it all the time? Not really. There is nothing to worry about it. The only time it becomes dangerous is when the states increasingly choose first option of aggressive competition. When states choose first option of aggressive competition, when they engage themselves in building up arms and alliances, when they engage themselves in resource monopolization, because a slight misreading of the intentions and actions by the other state may lead to a catastrophe. And this is where once the spark sets in, it becomes almost impossible to diffuse that wildfire. Now, see, we understood what security dilemma is and why it exists. Secondly, we know that the spiral is the worst case scenario among all choices we have, and it occurs because states unintentionally misread the actions of the other competing state. Now, question becomes why do states misread each other's defensive action as threatening? Why do states misread each other's defensive action as threatening? So, in 1976, Robert Jarvis, in his work "Perception and Misperception in International Politics," perception and misperception in international politics, gave us a clue why misreading happens. And his answer was very simple. It is the inherent nature of military capabilities that cause misreading even if a state doesn't want to. Because it is inherent nature of the military capabilities. Because see, almost all military capabilities are of dual use. Think about what Germany built in the early 1900s. Battleships. Now, battleships can defend your coastline and they can project power into someone else's waters. The same ship, but two completely different uses. There is no way to make a clear distinction from the outside. Think about what India has done since 2020 in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. India has built roads, India has built tunnels, airstrips, and many forward logistic infrastructure along LAC. From India's perspective, this is defensive connectivity. This is defensive connectivity. It gives us faster troop movement in case of Chinese incursion. And from our perspective, it is purely defensive because we have seen what happened in 1962. But from China's perspective, this is the development of offensive strike capability. Development of offensive strike capability. For them, India is building infrastructure to strengthen its holdout disputed area. They do not see it as a protective measure. So essentially, the same infrastructure gives two completely different readings, and neither side is irrational in their assumptions, given the information available to each side. So why misreading happens? Because dual use nature of defense preparation and lack of credible communication. This was Jarvis' central insight, that security dilemma is fundamentally a problem of misperception under anarchy, and not a problem of irrationality. But if this is the case, then anything and everything can be misread. So what do we do to minimize this misreading then? What do we do to minimize this misreading? Yes, reading then. To answer this, Jarvis suggests that this misreading can be minimized if state could strike a balance between the offense and defense capabilities. States could strike a balance between the offense and defense capabilities. Or say they could make a clear distinction between what is for offensive and what is for defensive purpose. Then to some extent the intensity of the security dilemma can be minimized. But problem with this is that it is purely theoretical, and it's almost impossible to make a clear distinction. For example, a country built a wall near border to hold the enemy's advance in its territory. In earlier times it would have worked out, but today an enemy state can bring you to your kneel without entering your territory. A missile launched from 5,000 km away can do more damage than a direct ground siege. So in present time it's meaningless whether you build a wall or not. But when you try to make a meaningful and a really useful defense capability, you will definitely going to blur the boundary between the offense and the defense. So in present times, everything almost works as an instrument of offense as well as a layer of defense. For example, you are building a long-range strategic bomber. This is clearly offensive, but what if you are developing it as a means of your second strike capability? You are developing it as a means of your second strike capability. Now it is an instrument of defense. When you develop it as a second strike capability means then it becomes an instrument of defense, because in your perception you are trying to restrain adversary from making a hasty choice. You are showing them that if you go on a misadventure you will not be spared. Consider another example, missile defense system like what India recently acquired from Russia. It is clearly a defensive capability. You cannot hurt your enemy with S-400. It only shoots down incoming missiles. So how could that be threatening? But China doesn't see it like that. According to them, if India can reliably shoot down Chinese missiles, then India's own offensive strike capability becomes more credible, because China cannot retaliate effectively. A purely defensive system makes India's offense more potent. So even a defensive capability intensifies China's fear. Right? So in a nutshell, every defense technology or development, be it hypersonic missiles or drone swarm or even as simple as a tank, can act in both ways and thus leaves ambiguity in its objective. Now, now what that means? It means that security dilemma is almost always operating at high intensity between major parts. And this balancing approach is not quite practical, right? Now, one thing is pretty much clear: there is no way to opt out of security dilemma. Means there is no exit, and by default, countries will roll into a self-feeding race. Right? This race can manifest in any domain, be it defense capability or technologies or economic growth. The only realistic option, it seems, that somehow, if we could slow down this race to manageable level, if we could slow down this race to a manageable level, and for this, Jarvis gave us two normative models for slowing down this race. One of that model is called as spiral model, and the second is called as deterrence model. Fine. Now, before I explain these models, let me tell you that these two are going to be very important content points, and we will be applying it, we will be using it in our answer writings. Clear? Now, before we move further, let me recap it all again so that you can maintain the flow and logic of this lecture. Fine. First of all, the computation and the race we see is all because of security dilemma. Further, we know that if this race isn't curtailed, then it may eventually lead to a World War type situation. So, how to stop this race? If we remove the security dilemma, but question becomes, is there a way to resolve this dilemma completely? Then answer is no. It's not possible. Why? Because you all know it is a structural feature of anarchic world, and there is no way to opt out of it, because no matter what you do, you will ultimately remain the part of this world. So what's the second best option do we have? If race can't be stopped, then let's try slowing it down so that we could have time to manage the apprehensions. So the next question becomes how to slow it down. And that we do by applying two models of Jarvis. Clear? Now pay attention. The spiral model says that the hostility between two states is primarily a product of mutual fear and misperception. Hostility is product of mutual fear and misperception. Neither side is genuinely aggressive. Both are reacting to the other's defensive action, which they are misreading as threatening. Neither of the countries is driven by expansionist agenda. It is driven by fear generating counter fear, and counter fear generating more fear, and the cycle continues. However, keep one thing in mind, that this model makes a clear assumption that both states are genuinely defensive, and neither of the state is driven by any offensive agenda. Now, further, the cycle doesn't move in a singular plane. Instead, it moves in form of a vortex. Every development is countered by a bigger development. First came the atomic bomb, then came bigger atomic bomb, then came hydrogen bomb, and it keeps scaling upward. Right? So it moves in the form of a vortex and not singular plane. So the crux is that both sides are genuinely defensive, and it is just misperception that is driving this cycle. So if by any measure we could remove this misperception, then somehow we can manage this spiral. So if this is the case, then spiral model suggests that all actors involved in spiral should try reducing the fear. Fine. Now how to reduce that fear? So Jarvis suggests that by creating transparency, by building diplomatic channels, by establishing verification mechanisms, by signaling peaceful intent. This is how we can slow down the spiral and perhaps reverse it, at least theoretically. So, what Jarvis suggests that we should create transparency mechanisms. We should strengthen our diplomatic channels. We should establish verification mechanisms, or we should signal peaceful intent credibly. So, by doing all this, we can somehow slow down this race. If the race is driven by misperception, where neither of the state is aggressive and both are driven by defensive agendas. Clear? Then there is second model, the deterrence model, which says something completely different. Now, in earlier model, it was presumed that neither of the state is aggressive, neither of the state, neither of the state is aggressive, and both were acting for defensive purposes. But in this case, one state is aggressive or driven by expansionist agenda. They are not reacting to fear. They want dominance. They want more territory. They want more control. These states see your defensive posture as constraints on their ambitions. The moment you appear weak, the moment you reduce your arm, the moment you make unilateral concessions, they read it as an opportunity, not as a peace signal. This is what happened prior to the World War II. The whole world was on a spree to appease Hitler and the Germany, and Germany kept on testing limits of the Britain and France. All political concessions given by Britain were portrayed as victory. So, in this situation where one state is aggressive, then how to slow down this race? Like any form of concession, as you might have given under the spiral model, here it would be treated as weakness and not with the reciprocal concession. Right? So, so in these kind of situation, the key is to build your strength, maintain credible threats, keep cost of conflict high and demonstrable. Then only an aggressive state can be put into restraints. Now, the first mechanism put forward by Jarvis of maintaining offense and defense balance is hard to put into action. We know that. However, the second two model mechanism is doable, but it also has some challenges. First, the selection of model is based on one key thing, on one key presumptions, that identification of the nature of adversary state, whether it is a defensive state or an offensive state. A defensive state or an offensive state. Because spiral model assumes that states are primarily security seekers, while the deterrence model assumes that there is possibility that a state is building up strength primarily because of expansionist agenda. So it is the most critical and difficult consideration to make, because there is no way to ascertain the true nature of state. For example, how hard US may try, but it cannot tell for sure if China is doing it all for protection or expansion. Or like before World War One, what we have seen was Germany a security seeker state that felt threatened by British naval supremacy and French-Russian encirclement? Or was Germany a greedy state with systematic ambitions to dominate Europe? And there is still disagreement about this among historians. But nonetheless, people who are in decision-making process needs a clear answer. And the answer matters a lot. Because if Germany was a security seeker, then the failure to engage more diplomatically resulted into war. But if Germany was a greedy state, then the failure to deter more firmly produced the war. So this question will always remain, and policymakers had to make hard choices in real time, right? So now, so far we have concluded that to slow down the risk, we need to apply either of the model depending upon which type of state we are dealing with. But now state face real challenges in identifying what an adversary state wants in reality. Now there are two lines of thoughts under realism that answer this fundamental question: what a state actually wants. What a state wants. And it is up to you which line of thought you pick while managing your international affairs. Because both give contradictory perspective and neither is incorrect. Now, one line of thought is called as defensive realism, and the other is called as offensive realism. One is called as defensive realism, and the other is called as offensive realism. The main proponents of defensive realism are Kenneth Walsh and Charles Glazer. Main proponents are Kenneth Kenneth Walsh and Charles Glazer. Now, they argue that states are primarily security seekers. States are primarily security seekers. They say every state is doing it for defensive purpose only. They do not want to dominate the world. They want to survive in it. They accumulate power up to the point where they feel secure, and then they stop. And they and the reasoning for saying so was simple. Every state wants to secure itself, and for that they have to increase their relative power and not the absolute power. Fine. This is the fundamental aspect of realism, and if you want to learn basics of it, then you can watch my previous video on realism. Clear? Now why state would stop at reaching certain level? Because excessive power accumulation actually makes a state less secure. Excessive power accumulation makes a state less secure because it triggers counterbalancing coalition from other states who feel threatened. It triggers counterbalancing coalitions. Now, you can understand this on a scale where two ends are minimalist and maximalist, and in between of these two lies moderate power. Now, the level of security each level of power gives you is different. At left end, minimalist cannot ensure security because they do not have adequate power to secure themselves. At maximalist end, it will again spiral into counterbalancing act. So at this end, although states have acquired great powers, but still they would feel less secure because enormous power ensures mutual annihilation. And if both are capable of obliterating each other, then again you have diminished your security level. Now at moderate level, the power you build comes into an ambiguous job, where the second state will not be sure if you are more powerful or them. But they will not risk aggression against you because of ambiguity it carries. Further, they cannot even go on increasing their power because they also realize that it will break the status quo and may put things into spiral. Because their thinking will be like, as of now, I am not sure if you are more powerful or I am. So this created a level of mutual security better than both had. And what a state wants ultimately, security. So according to Walsh, the structure of international system, basically anarchy, pushes states toward moderation and not maximalism. A state that tries to dominate invites the entire system to gang up against it. And history confirms this. Be it Napoleon's France, or be it Hitler's Germany, or the Imperial Japan, all attempted dominance, and all triggered overwhelming coalition against them, and eventually all were destroyed. So, so if someone who aligns with this perspective, he has very clear choice to make between two models, because he perceives every state as a natural security seeker, and a mismanaged security dilemma is just a product of misperception, not of genuine aggression. And if it is a product of misperception, it can be corrected by applying spiral model. So what we have to what we have to do under the spiral model is to enhance transparency, work towards confidence building measures, works toward verification mechanism, and so on. So the key is clear communication of intent and actions. This is why defensive realists are relatively optimistic about escape mechanisms like CBMs, arms controls, diplomatic channels, etc. They work because both sides genuinely want the spiral to stop. Fine. Now coming to the second line of thought, that is offensive realism, whose main proponent was John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer. Now, what offensive realists argue is not something very optimistic, like the defensive realist. Mearsheimer's central claim in the tragedy of tragedy of great power politics, is that states can never be certain how much power is enough for security. How much power is enough for security? Sounds logical, right? Because defensive realist says that the state would automatically stop after reaching a certain level. But the real question is how a state would know if that level of security has been achieved or not. And apart from this, the offensive realist identifies another problem, that okay, you stop at some level of power buildup, but that assessment of security will be based on your present situation. That assessment will be based on present situation. Present situation. Because if you start making assessments on future possibilities, then there will be no stopping point. It will automatically drift toward maximalism. And according to offensive realist, this is the key dilemma. Because what you are securing is not just your present, but your future as well. So the choice is obvious, that you cannot ignore your future security based on present commitments of the other state. And why offensive realism says so? Because in present time, let's assume somehow state gets to know that this level of preparedness is sufficient, considering the other state is defensive. But the real problem lies in the future uncertainties, because the intention of the other state can change overnight. It might happen that both states choose to stop at present level, but what if a hostile government comes into power and it might not honor the present commitments? So offensive realist says that a state must always be preparing for worst case future. A state must be preparing for worst case futures. And if you are always preparing for the worst case, you are always seeking more and more power. Not because you are evil, or not because you are greedy in some kind of moral sense, but because the structure of anarchy gives you no rational stopping point. Clear? Now, Mearsheimer adds another keynote to this. He specifically identified the nature of one particular kind of state, and and it is a straightforward conclusion you can easily apply to US-China rivalry. According to him, the most aggressive states are not the most dangerous in the world. Most aggressive states are the most not the most dangerous in the world. Instead, the rising power is the most dangerous state. The rising power is the most dangerous state. Because rising power, even with peaceful intentions today, will always have an uncertain future. And every other state must prepare for that uncertainty. So the question becomes how an opponent state deals with it. The existing hegemon has two ways to slow down the rising state, either by putting constraints, like what US is doing when it attacked Venezuela. It was trying to cut off energy supply lines to China to slow down its economic growth, or when US put severe constraints on technology transfer. So this way, an established power tries to restrain a rising power. Secondly, what US can do is work toward increasing its own power by investing heavily on technology and monopolizing resources, etc. So, so in a nutshell, rising power will always be the aggressive one, no matter how peaceful intent it shows in the present. But in future, it will certainly assert itself. Now, if you understood the key proposition of this school, then you know which model of Jarvis is to apply here. Because for this line of thought, the race is not the question of misperception, which can be corrected by using diplomatic channels. It is the logical, inevitable product of a system where every state rationally seeks maximum power to deal with uncertain future. Because for them, CVMs are just temporary poses. It is just a tactical move by rising power to gain some time for building the strength. The underlying competition never stops. So overall, as per deterrence model, states move towards maximalism. And when a defensive state faces an expansionist state, then building of credible deterrence is the way to slow down the dilemma. Clear? Now, this was all theoretical part, but UPSC demands application of the concepts. So before we proceed further with the lecture, let's apply this scenario to India-China equation, because merely theoretical consideration won't help in answer writing. We need application of the concept. We need to link question demand with our theoretical understanding. So let's explore two type of questions that can be framed on this part. Now, question may make statement in line with either of the thought and ask you to critically analyze it. For example, consider these two questions. First one, the recent diplomatic research between India and China, including engagements such as Tianjin dialogue process, indicates that both countries increasingly recognize the futility of prolonged confrontation and mutual benefits of stable coexistence. Critically evaluate. Now, the second question is post-Galwan, India can no longer rely merely on diplomatic assurances and confidence building mechanism in dealing with China. Again, critically examine. Now, pay attention to the word analyze. It means that you have to give a complete analysis of the statement, and for analysis you need some anchor point or perspective to think about something. And this is the most critical gap many students have while writing answers for a year. They lack the lens through which they have to analyze the question demand. For example, if a doctor has to examine or analyze some patient's illness, it involves three-step process. First, he will precisely write down the symptoms. It is like you corroborating all recent global happenings. This is what most people do when asked to analyze. They just enumerate the current happenings relevant to the question demand, but they fails to analyze it. They stop at just listing down the events, and that's why your answer always fell short of good marks. Now, what you need to do to analyze those symptoms? So, to analyze those symptoms, the doctor must link those facts to some underlying illness. Individually, each symptom might look unrelated, but when linked to an illness, they form a pattern. So, when asked for analysis, you must link those current happenings with theoretical anchor. So, theories essentially give you that perspective, they give you that understanding, they create a link between the facts and their analysis. And this is the biggest problem in UPSC circle, that people think theories are just value addition, or to make your answer look more presentable, or to create a sense of false knowledge. But in reality, theories are not like cherry on the top. Instead, they give foundation to your cake. So essentially, theories try to explain the core problem which humanity faced in the past. In present, the problem remains the same, just participants change. So all you have to do is to think like this. Uh, okay, this happened in the past, and same thing is happening in the present as well. And you have to apply that explanation to current happening. This is the right way to analyze, because if you lack perspective, then how will you analyze it? So at this step, two tasks are involved. One, you must possess theoretical understanding, and two, you apply that understanding to current happenings. Clear? Now the last step here involves addressing the another directive word given in the question, that is critically, which means first the doctor will align his analysis to most probable cause. The doctor will align his analysis to the most probable cause. But in end, he will write that these symptoms also match with other cause as well. So we need to check it from that perspective as well. So a fever can be because of bacterial infection, or can also be because of a viral infection as well. So in critical examination, there is a need to find out multiple interpretations. If it happens to be just an analysis, then you would have followed the interpretation that question had made with the statement. And if it asks to critically examine, then it means you have to find additional perspective to it. But your main anchor will remain the interpretation given in the question statement. So always follow this sequence in your thought process. All current happenings are like symptoms of some underlying cause. So you read symptoms or current events first. Then you interpret probable cause. And for those symptoms, there can be multiple causes. But question may ask you one more thing as well, to recommend suggestions. Now it is like doctor have to give prescription as well. Now if doctor have followed the three-step process given above, it will be easy for him to suggest a remedy. And how did that happen? Look, the core job of a theory is to suggest solution to a problem. So theories do not stop at just identifying the problem. They also suggest solution framework. For example, all these theories identify security dilemma as a problem and also suggest solution in form of the spiral and deterrence model. So if policy recommendation is asked, you write them as the fourth step of the process. And believe me, this four-step process is very helpful in not just writing down the main body of an answer. It also gives a clue about conclusion to question. For example, if a question stops at second step, if it asks you to analyze only or examine, then the third step will form your conclusion. Means you write down a short 2-3 line critical evaluation as conclusion. But if question itself demands the third step, that is critically examine or analyze or evaluate, then that means you have to take a stand and you can use fourth step as conclusion. Now everything forms the part of a logical sequence. So avoid just mugging up the current events. UPSC won't check your ability to memorize these events. Instead, it will ask you to analyze for which you need theories, and when it asks you to critically examine, then you need multiple perspectives. And multiple perspectives are accumulated through multiple theories. So this is what you have to do. Clear? So if you study all current events with this sequence, believe me, all this psychosis of dynamism about IR will no longer be an issue to you. Fine. Now coming to what exactly you need to do in these two questions. Now as I told you in analysis, follow the interpretation given in the question statement. Now how to identify which interpretation the question is aligning itself. See, if you look at the specific phrases like in first question, engagement such as tension in dialogue process or futility of prolonged confrontation, benefits of stable coexistence. Now what are all these? These are the phrases that indicates toward basic postulate of defensive realism. It is the defensive realism which says states are security seekers and spiral is product of misreading. Therefore, communication, engagement is the key for long-lasting peace. So, analysis requires explanation and application of defensive realism and spiral model. Then to critically examine, use second interpretation of offensive realism and deterrence model. Clear? Now let's move to the second question. Here focus on one thing, that India can no longer rely merely on diplomatic assurances and CBMs. This is what old offensive realism has to say. So you got your primary interpretation. Now follow this lead and apply it. For critical examination, follow the opposite interpretation of defensive realism. Easy? Now moving on, we will add another theoretical layer to the spiral model. So far we have learned that under spiral model, CBMs, clear communication, verification, etc. are tools to manage security dilemma. Here I will give you specific terminology that is often referred in IR for such actions. Now, if you remember, we talked about a guy named Charles Glazer, who was one of the main proponent of defensive realism. So his theory is essentially the same we understood under the defensive realism, but his main contribution was to identify the mechanisms to manage security dilemma. Now for that he identified two types of state. One is security seekers and the other is greedy states. Now security seekers are the one who is doing all for defensive purpose. These states only want enough power to ensure survival. While on the other hand, greedy states are the one building offensive capabilities. These states want expansion, domination, or revision of international order. Their ambitions go beyond security. So according to Glazer, states are primarily security seekers. And when states are security seeker, then it is just misperception that leads to spiral. So it is not the question of intention, but it's all about actions. So he says that your action should speak louder than your intention. Like like in any relationship issue is not trust, but the point is how we reassure our partner time and again. And this repetitive reinforcement creates trust. States may genuinely be security seekers, but they have to prove it from time to time. And words and vocal commitment alone cannot fill that trust gap. Because words are cheap in an anarchic system. Therefore, escape from the security dilemma requires making intentions clear through verifiable action. So, what are those verifiable actions? According to Glazer, verified transparency and institutional CBMs are such measures. It further includes arms control agreements that allow mutual inspection. So neither side has to fear of ghost capabilities that other side might be hiding. So if you can verify each other's arsenal, then you stop imagining worse arsenal which may not even exist in reality. Further, states can establish hotlines that allow direct communication during crisis so that misreading do not escalate into war. Further, diplomatic channels should remain open even during tensions. These mechanisms serve one specific function. They make intentions partially visible in a system where intentions are otherwise completely opaque. Now, now look at the actual diplomatic architecture of the international relations through this lens. Take example of hotline installed between Washington and Moscow after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. This is a Glazer escape mechanism. Take another example of SALT I and SALT II arms control treaties with their inspection protocols and agreed ceilings. These were another Glazer escape mechanism. The India-China Special Representative Mechanism, which involves senior officials from both sides meeting to discuss the border, is again a Glazer escape mechanism. The working mechanism for consultation and coordination on India-China affairs. The WMCC, again a Glazer escape mechanism. The resumption of hydrological data sharing between India and China at the Tianjin summit in September 2025. So all these are Glazer escape mechanisms intended to reduce misreading by infusing transparency. So while writing answers, do not just mention these actions in a fragmented manner. Use theoretical aspect of Glazer escape mechanism, which will give you extra depth and proper structure to your answer. Fine. Now, question comes: how reliable Glazer escape mechanisms are in slowing down the pace, and you will see that it ultimately forms a full circle, bringing us back to offensive realism from defensive realist assumptions. And this learning is profound because when you say India is confused in its policy approach, on one side we are pacifying China while on the other side running into US lab. For a beginner, it will look like a total mess because everyone needs a clear-cut answer, either black or white. But IR is a zone of ambiguity, and India is smart enough in not putting all eggs in one basket. Right? Now suppose both sides genuinely are security seekers. Suppose they have successfully communicated this. Suppose the CBMs are working. But does the dilemma fully dissolve? Now, Thomas Schelling gives us another important insight about it. Even if all CBMs, even if all verification mechanisms, even all transparency mechanisms are working fine, still you can't trust your opponent. Now, Thomas Schelling says that he was one of the most strategic thinker of the 20th century, and he says that it is not possible to build an unquestionable trust between two states involved in security dilemma. He says that it doesn't matter how robust architecture you create, but uncertainty will always persist. And as long as there is uncertainty, dilemma will exist, although it will hide itself beneath the layers of institution. So he gave a simple reasoning for this, which he described as the commitment problem. It says that even if I believe you are a security seeker today, I cannot be certain you will remain a security seeker tomorrow. It may happen that a new government comes to power with a more nationalist ideology, and we have seen economic crisis pushing leader toward foreign adventurism. So the problem is not your current intentions. Problem is not your current intentions. The problem is that I cannot bind your future self to those intentions. And because I cannot bind your future self, I must hedge today. I must maintain capabilities that guard not just my present but as well as my future against you. Take example of pre-World War One situation. In 1890s, Germany and Britain had significant diplomatic goodwill. We have seen the leaders in these countries were tied by blood. They had deep trade relationships with each other. They had matrimonial alliances. Now, if you just focus on these facts only, then both countries were showing a great deal of willingness in cooperating and engaging each other. But Britain's naval planner were not fully sure of Kaiser for what he might do in the future. So they planned for the worst case future. And their policy planning was to build dreadnought and the consequent arms race, which ultimately contributed to creating the very Germany they were planning against. So Schelling's commitment problem is that even good faith security seekers can produce uncontrollable spiral in future. Now bring this to India's present moment. At SCO Tenchin in September 2025, Modi and Xi declare India and China as development partners and not rivals. So, so if you look at it, then this was genuinely a language of warmth. Consequently, border passes were reopened. Hydrological data sharing was resumed. Tourism was restored. So it looks like relationship is back on track. But simultaneously, both sides continued their infrastructure build-up in border areas at full pace. So, what will you call this? Is this hypocrisy or bad faith? No, it is Schelling's commitment problem in operation. Both sides mean what they say in the diplomatic room today, and both sides know that today's diplomatic warmth doesn't bind future government, future military commanders, or future strategic calculations. So they simultaneously engage diplomatically and continue hedging militarily, not because they distrust each other at present moment, but they cannot make today's assurances binding on tomorrow's government. This is the condition India lives in permanently, and it explains something students consistently find confusing. Why India have a diplomatic reset with China at Tianjin while simultaneously deepening its Quad commitment? It is not contradiction. It is Schelling's commitment problem, which India is trying to manage rationally. The diplomatic reset manages today's relationships. The Quad, the US Defense Partnership, or the Atmanirbhar Bharat, the defense indigenization, all these manage the uncertainty of future. Clear? Now, before we continue, let me recap it once for you. Jarvis said that there is a way to slow down the race. Depending upon the nature and intent of the other state, you apply the respective model. But how do we get to know about the true nature of the other state? This question is answered by two lines of thoughts under the school of realism. Now, depending upon which line you pick up, you may choose the relevant model. Now, further expanding the scope of spiral model, we specifically identified glacier escape mechanisms. But we also explored that glacier escape mechanism doesn't resolve dilemma. So we identified the limitation where glacier mechanism will fail in case of Schelling's commitment problem, which completed our loop to offensive realism. We started with assumptions that states are security seekers. Then you applied spiral model. Then you implemented glacier mechanisms, and you stopped at moderate level of power. But then someone came and told you that in this you failed to address Schelling's commitment problem. And this is the same thing which offensive realism says, that you will never be sure about future. So states slowly drift toward maximalism. So this is quite confusing, because if you ultimately have to arrive at offensive realism, then what's the point of assuming that everyone is security seeker? But in reality, states are neither purely defensive or purely offensive. They oscillate between the two extreme ends, and as a decision maker, you work toward both ends. You try to employ glacier escape mechanism as long as it helps in managing the dilemma. But you are simultaneously building your capabilities so that if opponent states drop its defensive agenda, then you should have something to rely on. Fine. Now, moving on further, we understood glacier escape mechanism as an extension of spiral model. But what about deterrence model? How we deal with a state sitting on the other end of spectrum. So to understand what a state ought to do when faced with aggressive opponent, we will look into another concept, which is called as concept of balance of power. Now, one thing we know that states cannot escape this spiral permanently. We have seen Schelling's commitment problem will definitely re-intensify the spiral. And faced with that structural reality, state has to prepare in advance. So, so what a state can do to secure its future in addition to its present? Because glacier escape mechanism at the most can secure your immediate future. But for a long-term future, you have to act now. Now, question is what exactly we need to do? The answer is one of the oldest and most powerful concept in all of international relations, the balance of power. The core logic is simple. When one state grows significantly more powerful than others, or when one state appears to be building toward dominance, other states feels threatened, and their rational response is to prevent that dominance from being achieved. Now, states do this in two ways. First, by internal balancing, which means building up your own power. You spend more on your military preparedness. You invest heavily in advanced modern technology. Apart from this, you create strong economic foundation. So all efforts are directed towards self-reliance. India's Atmanirbhar Bharat defense indigenization program is internal balancing against combined China-Pakistan threat. India's ICET partnership with the US to build semiconductor capacity is internal balancing in the technology domain. So, in simple language, internal balancing is the act of developing our own economic, technological, and military capabilities, either with or without external help. So, internal balancing is an act of developing our own economic, technological, and military capabilities. Now, second mechanism we call as external balancing, which means forming alliances with other states to collectively counterbalance the threatening power. Take example of Quad. It is India, US, Japan, and Australia externally balancing against China's rise in the Indo-Pacific. Take example of AUKUS. where Australia, UK, US externally balancing China's rise or China's naval expansion. NATO's post-2020 expansion is external balancing against Russia. So external balancing is the mechanism where you rely on each other in case of eventuality or to counter threatening power. So according to this concept, every state tries to balance the rising power either by internal or external balancing. And this act of balancing is an action directed toward deterrence. So when you apply deterrence model, that means you will create deterrence through balancing acts. Now, if you look at present context, then you clearly identify where countries are trying to balance the other powerful state. For example, we know that China is rising power. Its defense budget has grown 7 to 8% annually for over 2 decades. China has the largest navy in the world in terms of number of vessels. It has militarized the South China Sea. It built the BRI as strategic infrastructure across Europe and Africa. So basically, crux is that it has positioned itself as the dominant power in the broader Asia Pacific region. Now, what the balance of power logic says that the other state will balance against China. Now, look at those balancing acts. The US has reoriented 60% of its navy to the Pacific. Japan has doubled its defensive budget. Taiwan is pitching to join AUKUS. India has joined the Quad. Vietnam deepened defense ties with the US. The Philippines allowed US military base again. Now, if you read newspaper, then all of these actions look like a series of separate foreign policy decisions. But if you view through the balance of power lens, they are a systemic response through which international system is automatically generating counterweight to a rising power that is perceived as threatening to the existing distribution of power. But there is a crucial complication here. Initially, we said that balance of power is an expanded mechanism under the deterrence model, like what was glacier escape mechanism under the spiral model. But the balance of power has its own security dilemma embedded within it. Now, China doesn't see it as a defensive strategy. Instead, China reads it as encirclement. Reads it as encirclement. So China deepens its own counterbalancing by tightening the China-Pakistan nexus, deepening ties with Russia at SCO, building the China-led SCO Development Bank, positioning research vessels in smaller states EEZs. Now, all those countries responding to China's rise read this act of counterbalancing as confirmation that China is aggressive, which they justify with further balancing. This further confirms China's encirclement fears. So a new cycle starts in domain of external balancing, or say alliance expansion. But we said that balance of power originally intended to stabilize the system by preventing dominance, but now it itself become a driver of security dilemma spiral. This is exactly what happened before World War I. Britain and France formed the entity as external balancing against Germany. Germany deepened its alliance with Austria-Hungary as counterbalancing. Both sides read the other's alliance building as confirmation of aggressive intent. Now, this balance of power mechanism is the key reason that it engulfed whole world in the World War. So instead of solving the dilemma, it intensified it further. Then does this mean that act of balancing is not the right mechanism to deter? No. Here is the key learning that the balancing act is necessary, but there is need to maintain a strategic ambiguity. Need to maintain a strategic ambiguity. Now, what does this mean? This is where case of India can provide a textbook example of balancing with a strategic ambiguity. For India specifically, it is engaged in both internal and external balancing simultaneously, as we have seen earlier. And this is not contradictory. It is the standard response of a state facing a compound security dilemma. But India is also aware of the limitation of this mechanism, that excessive visible external balancing can intensify the spiral, and it may provoke the very aggressive response from China which India is trying to deter. This is where India inserts strategic ambiguity. Now, what is this strategic ambiguity? Strategic ambiguity means a country does not fully commit itself to one rigid camp. Country does not fully commit itself does not commit fully itself to one rigid camp. It keeps its options flexible and develops relation with different sides depending on the situation. For example, India is part of the Quad while also remaining in BRICS and SCO. India does not publicly declare China as an enemy, but at the same time it prepares militarily as though China is a serious threat. Because of this, neither side is completely sure where India fully stands. This uncertainty itself becomes strategically useful. China knows that any aggressive move against India may push India even closer to the Western camp. Similarly, the West also knows that India is not a treaty bound ally and it can be pushed into choosing strict sides. Therefore, it deters the US and West from making aggressive moves against India, because they know that any deep push might drift India toward China, which they do not want at any cost. That's why we have seen that US many times giving India exemptions from sanctions regime, like exemption from CATSA when India bought S-400 from Russia. The strategic ambiguity allows India to balance China at the same time, avoiding rigid politics. This helps in reducing escalation risk, and also it preserves India's strategic autonomy. So, what happened prior to the World War I was overt external balancing. Overt external balancing, which increased suspicion, thereby leading the spiral. But balancing with strategic ambiguity or limited external balancing deter aggressive response from all sides. Balancing with strategic ambiguity or limited external balancing. This is also called as hedging, right? In international relations, this limited external balancing is also called as hedging. So hedging is a strategy where a state neither fully aligns with nor fully oppose a major power, and it maintains meaningful relationship with multiple competing powers simultaneously. And for what? To preserve its own flexibility, to reduce vulnerability, and keep options open as the strategic environment evolves. Further, it is important to differentiate hedging from two things. Since hedging looks like a country avoids choosing side, and it is often conflated with non-alignment. It is often conflated with non-alignment. But that is not true. India's original non-alignment movement was ideological position. It was an ideological position, a principled refusal to join either the US or the Soviet camp. It was based on moral and philosophical commitment to international value system like respect for sovereignty, peace, brotherhood, etc. While hedging is a strategic positioning. Hedging is a strategic positioning, not the ideological one. For example, if two camps lies on two ends, then strategic position means lying somewhere on the same axis, but tilting toward either side based on strategic environment and national interest. So the position where India stands, it is strategic in nature because we have flexibility to slide over the axis, and this freedom to slide over based on our interest is called strategic autonomy. Simple. So it is not a principled refusal to choose. It is a calculated decision to maintain maximum flexibility because the cost of clear alignment in any direction are too high. While NAM was not sitting on the axis at all, it was like India sitting somewhere outside the zone. So hedging can be called as strategic ambiguity or multi-alignment or limited balancing, but not exactly similar to non-alignment. Clear? Second mistake people often make about hedging is that they think it is lack of resolve. It is lack of resolve on part of India. Or a naive commentator would say India is afraid of joining US camp. But hedging is neither about confusion or nor about courage. So Quad plus SCO plus Russia plus USICT plus China reset plus BRICS, it is not contradictory. It is not policy confusion. It is rational management of multiple simultaneous security dilemmas, each of which punishes clear alignment with any single camp. If you signal clear alignment with Russia, then the US will punish you. But if you make clear alignment with the US, then another Galwan is waiting for us. So to avoid this, India follows multi-alignment doctrine, and it should not be interpreted as lack of resolve. Now, we will explore the full dynamics of alliance formation in another video where we will explore minilateralism as a dedicated meta aspect. For now, we will keep this concept limited as a mechanism under deterrence model. Now, based upon this understanding, I want you to attempt these questions. Now, apply the thought process I have explained earlier. Further, remember one thing here, that these questions may involve few other concepts as well we have not covered so far. So do not get worried about those concepts if you feel like lacking the content. Your only task here is to apply the understanding we have created so far under this lecture. Clear? Now, so far everything is good. We were trying hard that security dilemma does not translate into a conflict, but we cannot take it for granted that all these mechanisms will prevail. So the next part is, if a conflict breaks out, then how to manage it so that it does not become a world war or nuclear war. Now keep one thing in mind, that both spiral and deterrence model operates simultaneously during a conflict. For example, during Operation Sindoor, India kept its diplomatic channel open for communication, only for one reason, that it may not spiral out of control, and at the same time demonstrated strength with its drone technology or precision airstrikes, missile defense system, etc., as part of future deterrence. Fine. Now, when states cannot escape the security dilemma, and if conflict breaks out or may have high chances of breaking out, then how do you signal resolve? How do you protect your interest without triggering a full-scale war? The answer involves two interconnected concepts: the escalation ladder and brinkmanship. So here in this video, we will look into the concept of escalation ladder, and we will do brinkmanship in some other video. Now I'm going to give you the basic feature here because you need it to understand Sindoor's strategic logic. The idea of escalation ladder was conceived by American strategist named Herman Kahn. Herman Kahn. The idea was simple. In a conflict between two nuclear states, it is extremely rare that a minor crisis transforms instantly to a full-scale war or an all-out nuclear exchange. It is extremely rare that a minor crisis transforms into full scale war, or a nuclear war, or a nuclear war. Instead, the conflict moves through a series of distinct successive steps, and each step represents a higher intensity of conflict. A conflict moves through distinct steps, moves through successive steps, and each step represents a higher intensity of conflict. For our understanding, I have divided all steps or rungs into three major decisive levels. The first level we call as zone of subconventional conflict. Zone of subconventional conflict. It basically includes deniable action below the threshold of an outright war. It manifests in form of terrorism, use of proxy groups, or covert operation in enemy's territory. Now the second level is a zone of conventional military conflict. It includes limited military action to a full-scale engagement between the armed forces of two states. It starts from targeted strikes or specific infrastructure or airstrikes or limited ground operations. If both states fail to arrest the upward movement along the ladder, then it may transform into a full-scale conventional war. At this point, it becomes very difficult to retreat to previous levels, right? Then there is the last and final stage of nuclear exchange. It starts with nuclear preparedness to demonstrative nuclear detonation, intended to signal resolve. Theoretically, we can say that this is the last step where two states still can make a retreat. But if this doesn't happen, then it will be followed by use of tactical nuclear weapons. From here on, it will almost be impossible to climb down the ladder. Now it will cascade into full nuclear exchange aimed at mutual annihilation. Now you can see that each successive stage or step increases the risk and decreases the chances of escape. Or we can say that states have strong incentives to keep conflict at the lowest possible rung, because higher rungs carry progressively more catastrophic cost. And this means that in any conflict, both sides are simultaneously competing and trying to control the level of intensity. This is not weakness, it is a rational management of dilemma that has no exit. Now how this ladder operates. In a conflict situation, every state tries to make the first move, because that state will get to occupy the lowest possible rung, like terrorism or proxy warfare, with minimal associated cost. Now, by taking the initiative, the first state forces the adversary to make the next difficult decision. Now, the second state has two options. First is to respond symmetrically, or to occupy the same rung which the initiator has already taken up. For example, matching the minor border skirmishes with a minor border skirmish. But problem with this option is that the initiator has already calculated and accepted the cost involved at that level. So choosing this option won't deter the initiator. For example, Pakistan made the first move and engaged terrorists as state instrument, which obviously it will deny. Now, India for a long time kept occupying the same run. So now you tell me, did it deter Pakistan from launching terrorist strikes? No, because Pakistan initiated the conflict after accepting the cost involved. Now, the other option that second state has in order to create credible deterrence is by climbing up the higher rung, like what India did during Operation Sindoor. However, by doing so, the second state now bears the political and moral responsibility of escalating the conflict. And once the second state escalates, the choice moves back to the initiator, creating a dangerous psychological trap. Now, initiator has two options. First is to make retreat, because the higher cost may discourage the first state to match up or go higher in the escalation ladder. But there is a very serious dilemma here. If the initiator retreats from here, then it will signal weakness or lack of resolve. In geopolitics, this is dangerous because it damages the state's long-term credibility. Then second option is the obvious one, either to match up the new level or go higher in the ladder, but it carries higher cost. So here initiator got caught in psychological trap, because if it doesn't match, then it is a signal of weakness, and if it matches up, then the second state may escalate it further to create deterrence. This is where Pakistan caught off guard, because for 2 decades Pakistan had firm faith that India will not climb up to higher rungs. But with Uri and Sindoor, India showed a clear resolve that it won't hesitate in escalating it to a higher level. Now, Pakistan hesitatingly tried matching up India's level and simultaneously took help of US to restrain India from escalating it further. Moreover, India did not intend to climb up any further, because India's missile defense system proved very effective, denying Pakistan's higher levels. So for over 2 decades, Pakistan kept the conflict at lowest rung, at sub-conventional level, involving terrorism, deniable proxy groups, or covert operations. Now you understand this was clearly deliberate tactics. At that rung, India's superior conventional military was irrelevant, and nuclear weapons at the top of the ladder deterred India from climbing up to the conventional rung in response. Operation Sindoor was thus India climbing one rung up the ladder from sub-conventional response to conventional precision strike, while explicitly refusing to climb further. India was demonstrating that it could operate at a higher rung than Pakistan expected, without triggering nuclear escalation at the top. This mutual testing and stopping is not chaos. It is the escalation ladder being navigated by two states that understand the logic of managed conflict within a security dilemma they cannot escape. Now, we will go much deeper into deterrence theory, compliance, or brinkmanship, and extending deterrence in another video. But for now, carry these foundational concepts with you, as we will apply all this to India's compound security dilemma. Now, what I mean with compound security dilemma? It means that India does not face one security dilemma. It faces three overlapping spirals, each spiral feeding the other. The first spiral is that of India and Pakistan. Now, we all know that India and Pakistan went to war a few times. So for almost 4 decades after independence, neither of the country had any additional as in conventional military capabilities. But by the 1990s, India had steadily developed a clear conventional military superiority. Now it was obvious that in state fight, India will be harder to defeat. Now Pakistan's policymaker also understood this. So they had two options: either to follow a path which all other major powers followed, that is to develop economically, invest in conventional military capabilities, and indigenization of technologies, etc. Second option was to develop a nuclear weapon as an ultimate guarantee. The reasoning was simple. They wanted to secure themselves against India's conventional strength, and the traditional path is too long and too time consuming and too capital intensive. So Pakistan chose a shortcut and tested a nuclear weapon in 1998. Now the nuclear doctrine is clear. Any attempt by India to escalate into a full-scale conventional war will be responded with a nuclear escalation. And nuclear escalation means annihilation for both. Now on the surface, it looks like nuclear weapons created a freeze on conflict between the two states. Or say this created stability in the South Asian region. And undoubtedly, it was true to some extent. In 50 years after independence, we fought 4 wars. But after development of nuclear weapons, not a single war happened. Because both countries now live under fear of nuclear escalation, and neither side wants nuclear war. So a full-scale war is deterred. But Glenn Snyder in 1965 gave very crucial insight that a nuclear deterrence at the top of the escalation ladder creates instability at the bottom. Nuclear deterrence at the top of the ladder creates instability at the bottom. It means that if a full-scale conventional war is deterred by nuclear weapons, then conflict below the nuclear threshold is paradoxically safer to conduct, because both sides know neither will escalate a limited conflict to nuclear exchange. And Pakistan's military understood this perfectly. Under the cover of nuclear deterrence, which prevents India from launching an all-out conventional war, Pakistan could sponsor cross-border terrorism at sub-conventional level. We have already seen that why escalation is difficult between two nuclear-armed states. Now, this condition where nuclear deterrence provides stability at the top and at the same time it incentivizes instability at lower rungs. Now, this condition is called as stability-instability paradox. The thing which provides stability also incentivizes instability. So for over 2 decades, India felt trapped in this paradox. Every terror attack, be it Parliament in 2001 or Mumbai in 2008, then Pulwama in 2019 or Pahalgam in 2025, happened under this nuclear cover. Pakistan's calculation was right that India would absorb these attacks because conventional military retaliation carries a risk of nuclear escalation, which nobody wants. Now, in May 2025, India launched Operation Sindoor, making precision strike on terror infrastructure sites across Pakistan and POK. What was India trying to do? It was attempting to break out of stability-instability paradox by climbing one deliberate rung up the escalation ladder. So India demonstrated that conventional precision strike against terror infrastructure are possible below the nuclear threshold and will be conducted. India was trying to redraw the parameters of the dilemma. We are saying like that you thought nuclear deterrence protected everything below it? No. We are demonstrating that it doesn't. India made 3 explicit conditions. One, that it would maintain the conflict below the nuclear threshold, in line with India's no first use policy. India refused to be deterred by Pakistan's brinkmanship of posing nuclear threat. And 3, that from now on, Pakistan's sub-conventional tactics will be dealt with limited conventional actions. Fine. But notice one thing here. The dilemma was not escape. It was transformed. Now both countries have climbed up to a higher level and thereby increased the risk of escalation in future. So it may happen that next time Pakistan may feel pressure to strike before India can build justification for another Sindoor. So dilemma from sub-conventional level has been now transformed into conventional zone. Again, the key insight is that it is hard to escape from dilemma. It is just every action may create a new spiral at higher level. Now, coming to the second spiral, that is of India-China post-Galwan. Before June 2020, India and China had a difficult but manageable relationship. The 1993, then in 1996 and 2005 Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement created a working framework. Consequently, bilateral trade had grown over $100 billion. Leaders of both countries regularly engaged in summit-level meetings. So till Galwan, glacier escape mechanism between India and China were working fine, but nonetheless the security dilemma still existed underneath. We earlier talked about it that it may happen that when glacier escape mechanisms are in operation, then it might give impression that dilemma has been resolved, but instead it just go in hiding. Same was the case with India and China. The Galwan incident just brought it back on the surface. The security dilemma that had been building up for a decade suddenly became kinetic. Now, why did that happen? Now, look, India made an aggressive push to build border roads, tunnels, and airstrips in Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh. Now, China reads this as the development of offensive strike capability, or at least an effort toward changing the status quo. So China builds counter infrastructure, military villages, forward air bases, LAC roads. Obviously, India would read it as aggressive forward positioning. Further, apart from internal balancing, India chooses external balancing as well. It deepens the Quad engagement. Now, for China, it was a part of US strategy of encirclement. China responded with military supply to Pakistan that includes JF-17 jets, PL-15 missiles, or HQ air defense system, etc. Now, India could saw clearly two-front threat under real operation and not just apprehensions. India further accelerated its defense indigenization program. China deepens BRI in India's neighborhood, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, and all other neighboring South Asian countries. India builds Sagar and deepens the Colombo security conclave, revives Tinnokomali project. China positions research vessels in Maldivian EEZ. India engineers economic reset in Maldives. Then China deepens engagement with Bangladesh after Sheikh Hasina's fall. India sees its eastern flank becoming a strategic pressure zone. Now take a note of one thing. Spiral or dilemma was operating all time, but the Galvan incident was first incident involving a kinetic warfare as modus operandi since 1962 war. However, it will remain questionable whether it was an outcome of misperception or China's deliberate attempt to test India on higher level of dilemma. Fine. So this was all about security dilemma. We have explored it primarily through India, China, and India Pakistan lens. Now, your job is to identify where else in the world the security dilemma is under operation. Now, apply this understanding we had so far on three cases. First, NATO, Russia, and Ukraine case. A spiral that began with NATO expansion, escalated through Crimea and Donbass, and produced the largest conventional war in Europe since 1945. Now, the second dilemma is that of US and China in Indo-Pacific, a spiral producing the largest peacetime military buildup in recorded history. Both sides are engaged in simultaneous internal and external balancing at historic rates. Now, the third and the last dilemma involves Middle East between Iran and Israel. Clear? Now build the case for both defensive and offensive realism. Try to apply both models, expand further to glacier escape mechanism, Schelling's commitment problem, and balance of power mechanism. Then apply escalation ladder to each case. However, remember one thing, do not blindly apply escalation ladder everywhere because it specifically operates under nuclear cover. It will not be the case between Iran and Israel, and you can observe yourself why it is so. As there is already full-scale war going on between Iran and Israel already. If Iran had possessed nuclear weapon, then it would not have been facing this US-Israel assault. Further, most of these dilemmas are compound in nature. One dilemma feeds the other. For example, in India-Pakistan case, it involved China and Quad as external balancing.
In India and China case, Pakistan and US are external balancing, while in US and China case, India and Russia are external balancing. So basically, for one dilemma, other feeds back into the loop as external balancing. Now, for India, the conclusion is both optimistic and pessimistic. India cannot escape its compound security dilemma by being good because it will perceived as weakness. Then it cannot escape by being strong because it will intensify the spiral further. Also, it cannot escape by being diplomatic alone because the shelling commitment problem will persist. It cannot fully align with the US. If it does so, we will lose Russia. We will intensify China's fear and deepens China Pakistan nexus and push China for more aggressive stance. It cannot fully engage China because in doing so it loses Quad credibility. It will embolden Pakistan and India will leave itself exposed if China turns out to be offensive realist power. So the crux is there is no clean exit. The only option for India is glacier escape mechanism to avoid misreading, and we need internal and external balancing with strategic ambiguity or hedging to handle Schelling's commitment problem and a calculated escalation. Fine. So that's all about security dilemma, and I conclude it here. Thank you.